Richard Becker, Watercolor, Video 2, Marks with Equipment. Hello, this is Richard Becker. I'm going to show you how the equipment works, different kinds of marks you can make with these tools. So first off, we're going to have line work. Line work is where we're taking the pointed brush and using it much like a pen or a pencil and drawing with it, drawing lines. The line work will tend to be one of the later things you do in the picture. Not every painting you do will have line work, but probably most of them will. Here you can see in the trees, the branches, small little lines underneath the eave of the roof here. On this picture here, you can see line work underneath the arm, around the bracelet, edge of the chair, twirling little lines up here in the hair to make the curly hair. Around the masonry, bringing out the rocks, again in the branches. So line work. Generally, the better quality the brush you have, and generally the newer it is, the better it's going to point. With any kind of brush, the best way to make the best point you can with the brush is to put it in the paint and roll it like that, and that will point the brush as good as it can be, and then you can make relatively fine lines with it. So that's line work. Next, dry brush. This is where you're using the brush with very little water, and then taking that brush and dragging it across the paper, letting it skip so you get a broken up texture effect. This is probably a good idea to be using older or cheaper brushes for this because it's kind of hard on the brushes. You can see where I've used it up in here for the shingles. Here on the wall of the castle, all this in here to bring out the roughness of the masonry. This works particularly well for creating foliage. Here where I'm dragging it across the paper to break up and giving the sense of leaves at a distance. So that's dry brush. Then we've got dabs and stipples. So here, taking the brush, using the tip to dab, 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 creating leafy shapes. Then as I repeat this over and over, let some of those wet shapes touch each other. They cluster together and we get leafy effects. And then pretty soon that starts to become a tree or a bush. So different types of points will give you different types of leaf shapes. Different ways you press down on the brush can give you a more varied look. More bell-shaped, rounded, classic leaf shape. And of course, the harder you push down, the bigger the shapes. So whatever's appropriate to the areas you're painting. You can see in many of these paintings where I'm using that technique to create the leafy effects in these things. And over again. So that would be dabbing or stippling with a brush. You can use either a round or a square brush for this. You'll get some different effects. Then there's splattering or spraying. This is where you're taking the brush, loading it up and tapping it so you get a splattery effect. This can work quite nicely for a very loose effect. Like in this painting, I've used it quite a bit. In many pictures, I'll just use it just generally to loosen up some of the effects in the background. Spraying is when you're using a tool like a toothbrush, loading that up with some paint and spraying a misty effect in there. There we go. See how that does that. Now, if you don't want it to go on some areas, you might want to cover up with some paper towels or extra paper. You can see where I've used that one, that technique, and this one down here across the beach to make this more pebbly effect in there. So while you may not be using that very often, every once in a while it's the perfect technique to put into your picture. And of course, what else are you going to do with an old toothbrush, right? So you may want to add this to your watercolor supply kit. The main thing you're going to be doing with the watercolor are called washes. And it's just as simple as that. That's called wet onto dry, wet paint on dry paper, as opposed to pre-wetting the paper and then doing that. And you see you get a very different effect. Now, sometimes you prefer one technique over another. And then generally what you're going to do is let this dry, and then you're going to be overlapping areas, putting wet paint on top of dry paint to build up layers. Let's try a different color. And what happens, you get a third color effect as one color overlaps another. So that's wet into wet. Now, something that you do along with this is called mingling. This is where you're mixing paint wet into wet on the paper. Now, this is the most watercolor of all the effects. Well, you can do this with any wet materials. You just generally don't see it with oils or acrylics, but it's done all the time with watercolor. You can let that sit for a few seconds, let it dry into the paper a little bit. And then when you go back into it, you'll get less of a spread. Really nice for doing fields of flowers, like that. You can also add water to this. So let it sit for a little while so the pattern of drying is a little bit different, and then add some more water into it, and that will start to separate. Now that's a little more obvious in that one. You can also take the damp brush and use that to lead the paint around. This technique can work really good for doing flowers, creating the effect of different patterns of colors running through petals. It's also an ideal way to start your painting. With every picture you do, you want a combination of crispness and softness. Here we have the beginning stage of this painting, and you can see how much mingling is going on. Not a lot of definition yet, but that's what you want to do, is start out with a lot of softness, then gradually as the paint dries out, overlapping, usually getting darker with your colors, and creating more definition. Again, another unfinished painting, and you can see back here how I've mingled in the background and then let that dry and then gone on top of it with the branches and the leaves, building up a three-dimensional effect. Now, certainly not finished, but you can see how it's starting to develop. And that's one of the keys, is this idea of overlapping and developing, working from lighter to medium to darker colors. You can get some nice finished effects, like in here with the mingling inside those rocks. this effect here in the background where I've developed this forest behind these buildings here, painting wet into wet, creating this feeling of foliage back there. And I'm getting a couple of effects I want. I want a feeling of complexity. I don't want this to look flat. I want to look like there's a lot going on, but I don't want any detail because I don't want the focus here. I want the focus here. And so by building this with the mingling, it goes really fast. I get that feeling of complexity, a big forest back there, but we don't really focus in on any specific details because that's not what I want. You can also see where I'm doing the mingling here on the ivy, down here in the reflections of the foliage in the water. You can also see that I've started these buildings out with a lot of the mingling, creating this overall color effect, then letting that dry and then going on top of it with drier, darker colors, line work, dry brush, creating more of the sense of specific detail and textures on top of that. So that is some of the usefulness of mingling your colors. Some other tools you can use are sponges. If I stick my sponge in the water, and to do that, what you want to do is stick that sponge in there and squeeze it. Get it wet, and what you're trying to do is get it soft. And then I want to wring out most of the water, but have it nice and cushy, and then I can go in there and rub that sponge, and you see I can lighten up, and in many cases get back to white or near white paper. Now, one of the key things to doing this is the better the quality of your paper, the more scrubbing, because it'll be stronger paper, and you can do more lifting out with the tools. So in general, if you're using cheap paper, you just can't do much in the way of corrections. So you have to get it right the first time. And if you're just starting out, that's really hard to do. So I would suggest you don't buy cheap paper. Unless, of course, you don't plan to ever make any mistakes, but that doesn't happen. Another technique for bringing the whites back into the picture, because remember the paint is transparent. We're not using any white paint with the watercolor, is to scrape it out. We could go in there with a razor blade, and this would be on dry paint, and we could scratch the paint off. Now, of course, this tears up the paper surface. You can't paint over this anymore, so this has to be the absolutely last thing you do in the picture. And you can see where I have done that on this one, where with a lot of these little branches in here, it was easier for me to scrape them out after I painted in the leaves. Now I painted around the larger sections of the trees and the larger branches, and then after I painted in my background, I scratched out some of that. And if you look closely, you can see that different quality of edge, where this is pretty crisp and this is kind of broken up. But at a distance, doesn't matter. So that's the easy way to do it, and that's generally what you want to do, is the easier way to paint your pictures. Another technique we can use in here is lifting out colors with Q-tips or cotton swabs. So you can use these like little sponges. So what you do is you stick them in the water and they'll puff up like this. So then what you want to do is squeeze them down, get them nice and tight. And then you can go in with that and lift out small areas. Very controlled. See how that works? And the paint's going on the Q-tips. So you use up quite a few Q-tips when you do this. But fortunately they're fairly inexpensive. So see how that works? So if you look at this painting, you can see this edge here was all lifted out with a Q-tip. So pretty convenient way to bring lights back into the picture. So I hope this is helpful. I'll be doing another video on just the basic technique, working in layers next. So watch out for that one and hope to see you later. Okay, bye-bye.